Okay, so I think we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to what is actually the very first webinar in FEN's new College Success Network series. For those of you who are new to FEN, we're the Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development, and we primarily focus on campus community partnership, which has historically meant for us working with offices of civic engagement, student volunteerism, service learning, all of those types of offices on campuses that work and put students out into the community. And over time, we have gotten more interested in college access and success. As I was just saying to another group of people, you know, every campus we work with, and there's about 25 campuses in the region that are members of FEN. You know, everyone has tutoring programs and mentoring and STEM initiatives and, you know, all of these different things that we're doing in schools and with young people. And what is the point of all that work? It's so young people grow up to be healthy, productive adults. And increasingly, we know that means a college degree. And yet there is a large and persistent gap in, particularly for low-income first-gen students. You know, they're getting into college in increasing numbers, but they're not necessarily getting through to a degree and on time. And so, you know, and here we are, a network of colleges and universities. So perhaps we can do something about that. So this call is meant to be part of a long-term dialogue over time and space, where we try to answer the question around, you know, what are we doing to, just in the data sphere, to track and understand what is going on with low-income first-gen students, underserved students more broadly on our campus, and of course, what can we do to turn around some of those trends. So I'm really excited that we have two different campuses speaking and presenting with us today. First, we're going to hear from colleagues at Bryn Mawr College. We have Dana Levy, who is the Director of Career and Professional Development, and Katie Krimmel, who is the Associate Dean for something called LILAC, Leadership, Innovation, and Liberal Arts Center at Bryn Mawr College. And then we're going to turn it over to a completely different type of campus, a large public. So Shannon Conklin, who's also in career services, but at Temple, and she's the Associate Director of Assessment and Technology at the Temple University Career Center. So I am going to cross my fingers and hope that what we tested on Tuesday works, and I'm going to attempt to make Dana a co-host so that we can see her screen and she can share their PowerPoint. And so we're going to hear first from Bryn Mawr for about 20 minutes, then from Temple for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. And I would just ask that if you're not speaking, to please mute yourself so that we're not hearing, you know, background noise and whatever. And if I have to, I can mute you. And that's it. So take it away, Dana.
Great, thank you. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for having us today, Hillary. I think we started some really great conversations probably over the last few months, and we're happy to share with colleagues a little bit about our process. And I would say this is something that we're trying and we're starting, and we're learning a little as we go. So I wouldn't position ourselves as 100% experts just yet, but in the hopes that any of our steps or any of our questions inspire or help you get started in identifying and disaggregating your data and figuring out who uses your offices and services. We wanted to share a little bit of what we've learned so far. So a little about Bryn Mawr College, just in case folks aren't as familiar with Bryn Mawr as we are. We're a small private women's liberal arts college. Our population is about 1,350 undergraduate students. Most are full-time and live on campus. A few quick facts about Bryn Mawr. 20% of the student body identifies as first generation. 73% receive some form of financial aid. And the self-reported race ethnicity of our undergraduate student body is as follows. 22% identify as international students. 34% identify as one of the following: African American, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, or multiracial. and 39% of the student body identifies as white. Our majors are diverse, so when you think about liberal arts, sometimes folks don't always think of the sciences, and we certainly have a wide variety here. So about a third of our students are humanities majors, about a third are the natural sciences. Bryn Mawr is actually well known for producing a high percentage of women STEM graduates compared with other institutions, and 37, another third, little more than a third are in the social sciences. So that's just a little bit about our institution to get an idea who we are. Whoops, there we go. Okay. And one more. So Katie Krimmel and I are part of LILAC at Bryn Mawr College, which stands for the Leadership, Innovation, and Liberal Arts Center. The center, which was formed about 6 years ago, is comprised of the civic engagement and the career and professional development areas, with a collective mission to prepare and support liberal arts students and alumni to be effective, self-aware leaders in their chosen life pursuits. So we talk about that, and we talk about that in the framework of sort of these 9 competencies, which you can see on the screen. And these are tied closely with some of the NACE career readiness competencies. There are some digital competencies that are coming around on a lot of campuses in certain areas. And so these were a combination of some of the ideas that formed LILAC's mission, as well as paying attention to the environment around us and what's happening in higher education. So these, our programming and services are built around these 9 competencies that connect. Our civic engagement office and our career and professional development office both have their own separate mission statements as well that are a little bit more specific to the roles their offices serve. And so this way, this framework is a way for us to come around a common set of topics, themes, and areas of focus as we develop joint programming for students. So in the spring of 2018, in preparation for our end of the year reporting, we had to look at outcomes and impact of our LILAC Center. Our team engaged in work called Creating Pathways, so as to align with our key aspects of the institution's strategic plan. So we have Pathways to Purpose is one of the items in our strategic plan. And so we were looking at what are the pathways that students follow through LILAC, whether it's programs, services, interactions, what kind of pathways do students take through to our programs and through them. Our staff is about 18 total, so we divided into 3 working groups, and we were given a very open-ended task in terms of identifying those pathways. So very loose in terms of how, and I think that was intentional in terms of trying to develop some creativity among the people who are presenting these programs and meeting with students and working with students. What did we see as our best way of finding out some answers to how people's pathways shape up? So first, I'll share a bit about the work in my specific team, including our questions, our process, the tools we used, and what we learned. Then I'll turn it over to Katie Krimmel, Associate Dean for LILAC at Bryn Mawr, and she'll share with you the larger scope from which the same participation data were analyzed. She'll also share with you her questions, her process, her tools, and resources. So first I want to share a little about our questions. So my particular group, we were a group of interested data people. So we kind of dubbed ourselves data nerds, and we were excited to see what we could look at. So one of our first things we did was open up a spreadsheet of data and started talking about it and what could we learn. We used a document that contained all student attendance at workshops, walk-in hours, and appointments for one full academic year. In that file, Katie had assigned a number to each activity based on varied factors such as the depth of involvement, length of time, that sort of thing, using a 5-point scale. So some examples on that scale would be a drop-in interaction, which is very short, might have been a 1. A career counseling appointment would be a 2. A recurring Saturday of service experience would have been a 4, and a multi-day intensive kind of boot camp program would be a 5. So just to give an idea of sort of how we broke those out. So our work was very ambiguous, but we continued to meet throughout the spring semester, and a few questions emerged for us. And some of those questions were, does a 5 really equal a 5? Does that, are all 5s equal? Does it involve a little bit more than perhaps the length of time or going off campus or something, you know, more involved, or is it something deeper? So certainly thinking about, are there ways to maybe reassign or calibrate the 1 through 5 scale? What stories do we need or want to be able to tell? So sometimes those of us on the front lines working with students, we know the stories that happen, but are we collecting data that helps us to share those stories? What are the stories we want folks to know so that we can get the resources or recognition that we're seeking? So those are some of the questions we asked ourselves. How do our programs serve students beyond engagement or participation? So they come to a program, but what goes on afterwards? Is there depth? Do they think about it later? Is there reflection that happens down the line that later changes a decision or have another impact? Is it lasting? So those are some of the things we wondered. How do students access our services? And so we have some ideas around that, but certainly we'd love to know a little deeper, how did they come to us? We looked later about level of engagement, and I'll share a little more about that in an upcoming slide, but just trying to figure out how do we get them to us, because I think once they get to us, they do tend to engage pretty well across a lot of different things. We also wondered how student employment factors in with other experiences, and I can't recall the number off the top of my head, but we have a very large percentage of our students who have either an on-campus or an off-campus job. And in fact, many have more than one. And so we know that that is a major part of our students' lives. And so we wondered and also acknowledged that coming to our programs isn't the only way students are developing, growing, interacting, challenging themselves, that sort of thing. So my group's process, we soon recognized we were not going to be able to answer all of those questions over the course of a few weeks, especially with the data given, the data that was currently available to us. We chose to focus on who uses our services and how they access them. We thought of correlating the participation with identities such as federal work study recipients or first-generation student status, athletes, affiliation with our Posse Plus program, for example. So we brainstormed a few areas. We reached out to other offices on campus who would likely have the information on which students were affiliated with these aspects of identity. Of the requests made, the cleanest data that we received was on the first-gen status of our students. So we moved forward with examining just that variable. We used Excel. We figured out how to do the VLOOKUP function where you can bring data in from one worksheet into a different file and connect it together. So a good exercise for us in learning some Excel tools. And we use pivot tables to sort of look at different types of involvement across different things. So for example, our new questions emerged that were, do first generation students participate at the same rate and at the same depth as their non-first generation counterparts? So it took us a while to get to what our real question was going to be with the data that we had in the time frame given, but that's what we focused on. Okay. One thing we learned through this process is that the data resides in various places on campus. Administrative offices may have information that you seek, but it may or may not be complete or in an organized way that is usable, or it might not be available quickly. So across our different departments, some of us keep data at the fingertips and we can send it out to anyone who asks at a pretty good moment's notice. Other people, they may not keep it in the same way and might have to take a while to compile and get that to us. And so those were some of the things we sort of discovered. A big key for us was working with our institutional research office. Some of the questions and some of the factors that we considered, those are things that the institution as a whole also cares about. And so that was probably our best partner in the process. They even tried to provide training with us, training for us. We were trying to figure out what tools in Excel would be best. One suggestion was using index matching to pull information across different worksheets. And despite a lovely handout full of instructions, none of us could make that work. So we gave up on that, and we, again, used the tools and the skills available within our team. But we were able to take a look. And we saw that there weren't really any appreciable differences between first generation and non-first generation students in terms of how they engaged with us. So more of the question later was about how do we get more people to engage with us? So of the entire student body, compared to how many engaged with our programs, let's look at that percentage in the future and see what else we can do to try to help get the pathway into our programs, because the pathway through them seemed to be initially something that was promising. So in my particular group, we presented our findings. We talked about that as a team. And we shared some things that, wish list items and questions and other things that we'd want to think about or do moving forward. And so one of the things at the top of our list was a data person. And I know that's probably a wish list at a lot of college campuses, and some offices in fact even have that. So it may or may not come to fruition, but we figured let's make our wishes known so that if ever the resources and the opportunity came to be, that folks knew that's what we were hoping for. We will continue to examine how we collect data as well as how we analyze it. As we continue this work, I think our skills are starting to develop a little bit more. Some of us are a little bit less afraid of trying new things with some of the data, going to trainings or certain sessions at conferences that maybe we wouldn't have thought of in the past. And so I think that's always a great thing to advance our skill sets. And we've periodically had some folks from institutional research come and do a practice data set with us and practice running the numbers and doing pivot tables to answer certain questions. So that's something that you could try and see if folks in your institutional research office would be willing to come and do a little training session with you. So those are just a few things in terms of my particular group on this process. I'm now going to turn it over to Katie Krimmel, Associate Dean for Lilac at Bryn Mawr, who will share with you about how this work was expanded upon.
Thanks, Dana. So I couldn't agree more about the importance of learning Excel skills and working with data. And I think it is a muscle that's very important to continue flexing, but can also be very hard to do when you're executing programs and trying to work with students and making students the primary reason for the work that we do. But I do think looking at the data that we collect can give us a lot of information on where to go with certain directions and make sure that we're serving the students in the way we think we are. So building a little bit off of what Dana said, as the leader of Lilac, I wanted to make sure that we were looking at engagement of our students across opportunities that were available through civic engagement and through career and professional development. And a little bit more of specifically what that means here. One of our goals through Lilac has been to really develop a diverse menu of options that offer students different ways to connect depending on what they're ready for at the moment. And those options include annually over 300 events and courses, both things that are co-curricular and curricular that we offer to our students, as well as hundreds of appointments and walk-ins and ways for them to interact with us personally as a staff. In the interest of time, I'll just very quickly highlight the other thing that's on this slide, which is the Great Jobs and Great Lives, the 2014 Gallup-Purdue Index Report. And the reason I put that there is that's a lot of what drives me with the why. Why do we want to look at engagement? Why does it matter? What's important about it? And if you haven't read this study, I would encourage you to do it. I know our senior leadership team here at Bryn Mawr and our president, who comes from the psychology background, is very interested in this. And when you look, there were a quick summary, 30,000 undergrads were surveyed, and the percentages that are listed up there are those that said they strongly agree with those statements. What I find fascinating is those that agreed with all 6 is only 3%. And so I think when we think of engagement and when we think of that here at Lilac, I use some of that as a bar to say, well, what do we mean by engagement? We mean they're building relationships. We mean they're doing projects. We mean that they're doing internships that are applying their classroom learning. So the other thing that I looked at, so when I was thinking this summer of how do we want to look at this data, I always think it's really important to think about what questions you want to ask. There's probably a million questions that are out there. But the ones that I wanted to focus on were, how are all students engaging in developmental experiences across the academic year? What does participation look like across different demographics? So for me, those included what were their majors, what were their class year, their ethnicity, whether they were athletes, first gen, international students, whether they were on financial aid, etc. And then I was also very curious to know, were students or are students equitably accessing the resources offered by Lilac? Or when we looked at this data, where we're going to find that we were missing certain groups, and that would then impact how we reached out to certain populations. And so I'll talk a little bit here about process, and then I'll quickly go through sort of the learnings and what's next. But in terms of the process, I would say there were two parts to start it off. The first is determine the student data that you're going to use as a baseline. So we all know that the student population is evolving, and it can evolve on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And so then when you're looking at, well, what's the denominator that I'm trying to divide by? That's a problem. So you got to figure out what is that snapshot in time that you can look at. And so one of the pieces to get to that student data set is to create definitions of terms and write them down. So what are we looking for? For example, for Bryn Mawr, study abroad is not included in our institutional research's census data. So if I had gone to institutional research and said, give me your census data for March, they would give me a number that would not have included about 1/3 of our junior class. And so figuring out that definition beforehand and saying to them, actually, we need the census data, but I need you to include all of those juniors, even though they're not technically enrolled in the college at that time, gave me a really good base point. Now, I could have also chosen to pull that information from Handshake and say, well, those are all our students. But depending on who's on leave, who's withdrawn, who's not, that might not be the most static set of information. And so that's why we chose to use the census numbers from institutional research. After getting that data, the next step was to do a quick sort of visual check, because things that institutional research didn't provide were athletes. So that I needed to go to athletics and say, can you share with me what students were student athletes last year? We also didn't have information about our Posse scholars, so that required outreach to those who leave that program to get that list of students. And so making sure your data set's complete. So then you have the one set of data that's clean and good and usable. And I will say in that data set, we didn't have student names either. It was just based on ID. And the ID, the unique ID, is so incredibly important for keeping the data clean and finding ways to connect it to other pieces. The second set of data and sort of Excel sheet that we then created was the engagement data for the academic year. And this came primarily from data we collected through Handshake that we use for registration and post reporting on all of our events and all of those opportunities that we offer to students. We also use Qualtrics a little bit, and then our team also does annual reports, and that sort of coincides and gives me a check and balance against the information we're pulling from Handshake. Is that matching exactly what that staff member pulled for that particular program? And so then creating that spreadsheet, again with the ID number, is absolutely critical. The third step then is to combine that information from the two data sets into one. So you have the clean student data and all the demographics, and then you're able to pull in using VLOOKUP all of the engagement data that's coming from the other spreadsheet. The other part I'd add that's really helpful there is going back to those, what are your research questions? When you're doing that, creating tables or templates of what you want the output to be when you analyze, so that you know what pieces of data, what analysis you're doing and how to fill in that table, so that you don't get sort of lost in this big data sheet and start doing pivot tables or lookups, and you could go crazy and spend lots of time in it, but it's not actually accomplishing the goal of answering your research questions. So then the next step was to run reports based on different demographics. So for example, I broke down our data by how many students completed our sophomore plan by all of those demographics that were on the first slide. Another example is by class year. How do you break down all of those demographics by class year, as well as LILAC participation in events? And then I think the fifth step is to really analyze that and look for trends in what's happening. And I'd say another tip that's really useful is creating a table of contents for any of the tables and figures that you create, so that you have a reference point to go back to. And so for example, this project, there were 43 line items of tables and graphs, but titling those and having those so you can reference them quickly. So then very quickly, I'll go through the learnings and challenges. Again, good engagement data needs to exist. So when we had Handshake, that changed the game for us. The year before that, we collected that data in a much more non-systematic way. And there was a lot of time that I spent just cleaning the data and scrubbing it and making sure that that initial engagement data sheet was in the same format. And that was not by anyone's fault. It just takes more time to combine versus to output from Handshake. Unique ideas are critical. Picking a snapshot of data to have a common denominator for the student population, and then messaging how you did that, what was the methodology, as well as provide a solid understanding of engagement across various demographics during an academic year. So that's what it allowed us to really look at and either affirm what we were thinking or challenge us on those assumptions. I would also say always keeping the projects oriented toward the college's strategic plan is a way to make sure that you're making a good use of your time and energy and resources. And then in terms of challenges, this is a $1 million question. How do you find quiet, focused time to do the work? Because it is hard to do, and it's hard to do it in small chunks. And so that is a real barrier, and you really have to figure out how to prioritize that. Collecting engagement data consistently, so making those definitions. What am I going to collect this year? What's included so that you can replicate that in future years? And same with determining what data to analyze and what do you share with relevant stakeholders? Because you could have a whole lot of data, but if it's not relevant to the people that are asking you different questions, it may be that's not worth where you should invest your time. And then finally, what's next? So ideally, we could replicate a consistent data collection and analysis process over multiple years. So we've done this for one academic year. And ideally, if we can build the same methodology, we do this over a student's 4 years here. So you could say this was their engagement over 4 years. Similar to what Dana said in terms of the engagement score, well, what's the best way to do that? We tried one way. I don't know if that's the best way. And so how do we continue to look at that? How do we correlate engagement data across years with outcome data collected at graduation and 1 year out? Do we see any trends? What does that tell us? And ideally, my dream goal, which again, I don't know if it fully is worth the time and investment, but would be to develop a framework for a longitudinal study so that you could see snapshots in time and that development across a student's life cycle. So with that, I want to turn it over to our colleague at Temple. So Shannon, we will stop sharing our screen and hope that you can now share yours.
Let me know if that's working, Shannon.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, that's step number 1. Step number 2 is sharing my screen. So I'll get that up right now.
And by the way, that was great, Dana and Katie. It's quite impressive from a fellow data nerd to another. All right, looks like you're good to go, Shannon.
Excellent. Well, first of all, I'm very excited to, number 1, see all the great work that's happening at Bryn Mawr that we actually overlap a lot with in terms of what we're working on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our project regarding our own engagement score. And first, I just want to give some context. Here at Temple University, I'm part of the Central Career Center, and our mission, which is up on the screen, is that we're a central resource that builds collaborative relationships among the Temple community and empowers students and alumni through comprehensive career development services, driving successful careers. And so for a little bit more context, we have 41,000 students, undergrad and graduate, and that includes our Japan campus. So we have a big population, and I'll note I'm fighting a cold right now, so if you hear a sniffle, I'm in the midst of that battle. So with our engagement score focus, we really wanted to give some meaning to Temple University's Career Center engagement. And I'm sure just as Dana and Katie were speaking about, having so many different piles of data, and you're just wondering, how can I give this meaning? How can I make sure that we're having a real impact on our students? So that's really where this all started for us here at Temple. And I'll note we're very much in the beginning of the process. I would say that we're entering phase 2. Phase 1 was last semester, following our strategic planning process this summer. And just my long-standing role as the Associate Director of Assessment and Technology here at the Career Center, and just seeing how much information that we have. And I just have wanted to always bring it together to help us really understand how are students utilizing our services, who's not utilizing our services, and I'll get into more detail about that. So when we sought to just bring together all these different data points over the years and just have a more meaningful picture about all of it. And our data really focused on data we have from Simplicity. So we were on Simplicity, now we're currently on Handshake. Of course, our first destination data, and then also the university data, recognizing there's a lot of information out there that we don't have within our systems, but that we can partner with our university partners on campus to, again, like, give more meaning and create a fuller picture. So with that, let me go to the next slide. So I want to talk about, as Dana and Katie were talking about, one of our strategic goals this summer that we developed for this year is focused on inclusion and showing our commitment to equal access to career resources and services for students from all backgrounds. And this is where we want to just frame our engagement score, at least this first phase. And it's really the leading question we sought to answer, which is who's accessing our resources and services, and again, understanding any gaps and how to address that. The big questions that were guiding our engagement score project, and I know that there'll be many more questions to come, which is the classic who, what, when, where, how. We wanted to focus specifically related to our strategic goal, first generation students, historically underrepresented groups, transfer students, and also looking at school college activity, because we're part of the Central Career Center and there's so many schools and colleges here at Temple. We are always looking to understand how that behavior differs by major, by class year, by degree level, and many other aspects. So these were some of our big picture questions. You know, who are they? What are they using and not using? How are we serving them? And then also looking on a more granular level. So for example, things like, are they logging into Handshake? And then what actions do they take? Are they coming in for multiple appointments? Are they subscribed to our newsletter? Just trying to, you know, build connections, at least on that scale. And then ultimately where we're hoping to go with is looking at the impact on their outcomes, or how their career intention based on university data, again, how does that look on the other side of this all? So really what we're hoping ultimately to accomplish with our engagement score project is, you know, how can we bridge or address any gaps that we find? So for example, as I was saying a little bit before, if they only log on to Handshake but they don't attend an event, how can we better encourage that behavior? Or if they come in for multiple appointments, are they also seen by our career network partners? Or if they come in for multiple appointments and get their materials ready, are they then taking the action to apply to positions? And then ultimately, does that lead to an internship, or does that lead to full-time employment as their career outcome? So it's really, again, like bringing all this information together to just understand how can we bridge the gap and then ultimately impact their outcomes. So some detail on our process. And as I was saying, we're really entering phase 2. So this process really reflects where we've been so far. Number one, and I have to definitely give credit to my colleague, Mark Coloco, who's our senior coach. He's really played a huge part in this project and framing it within our strategic goal. So when we look to focus on first gen, historically underrepresented groups, I really turn to his developing expertise in this area, because he's a current doctoral student in the EDD program here in higher education. So he helped define the populations, because we wanted to make sure that when we define these populations that they're consistent with what the literature is saying. And I have a few articles that he shared with me that I'll show in the end. But also that we were defining the populations in a way that was consistent with university data, so that we're not, number one, reinventing the wheel, but that we can continue to apply this as we move forward. So that was a big part with our process and where we started, which was, okay, we want to understand the behavior of these students, but who are they and how do we define them so that we're consistent with the larger institution, and then again with the literature and other trends. Another part of our process was also just engaging campus partners. And we're fortunate to have some really incredible partners here at Temple. Again, to my colleague Mark's credit, he connected us with Lori Salem, who is the Assistant Vice Provost and Director of the Student Success Center. She does a lot of data and research and analysis when it looks at the engagement of students across the different aspects of our portfolio. So I should mention we're in the same portfolio as her center. Also, our division, which is the Division for Undergraduate Studies. There's an assistant director for undergraduate strategic initiatives. She does a lot of work looking at risk populations and retention, so she has a lot of access to information as well. So last semester we had meetings with both of them just again to understand how to define, and then also what other data is out there that we should bring into the information that we have. Our other key part of the process is we have a graduate intern. So if you're thinking about, oh, I wish I could have someone that's focused on data, one thing that we were, I'm dedicated to assessment, of course, but there's a lot of other projects, and we wanted to have a graduate intern who could really hone in on a specific project like this engagement score. So we brought on a graduate intern who's earning her master's in economics right now, and she's focused on data analytics, and she's amazing. And she's really brought a lot of expertise and a really great perspective to this entire project. So she's been focused on this, and that's something that I would encourage you to consider if that's possible at your campuses, as far as the time and resources, is maybe look to a graduate intern possibly. Another big piece, of course, are the tools. So all of our data we brought into Excel using pivot tables, and then where we might be going with this potentially when we're ready for more sophisticated analysis is using R possibly. So that's again where our graduate interns expertise comes into play, and when we're ready to take it to the next level. The other big thing about our process is really just an ongoing discussion among our leadership group here at the Career Center, and making sure that as we think through the engagement score, we're getting everyone's opinion, because our Associate Director of Career Development has expertise on drop-ins and appointments. Our Director of Employer Partnerships has the expertise on on-campus interviews and job application. Our Assistant Director of Communication, he has the expertise on newsletters and all these other aspects when we were looking at, okay, what are the different elements of engagement that we need to think through, and then ultimately how we're going to weight them to make sense out of all of this. So the ongoing discussion, which will continue on, that took place a lot through Google Docs, the collaborative features that comes with that, so that we could all be putting our thoughts and information into one place, adding comments, so that we don't lose any traction as things are getting developed. So those are a big piece to our process, and like I said, it's still very much a work in process, but that's where these are the steps that we've taken so far. So what does our engagement score consist of? So with all the discussion and looking at just how much information that we have available, just within our office, and that would give us the most meaning, we decided to focus on these 6 areas. So first, we looked at newsletter recipients. So we send out a monthly newsletter to all students. So number 1, we wanted to see, okay, who's getting our newsletter? Number 2, the number of appointments. Number 3, the number of drop-ins. Number 4, number of logins to our CSM. So we're just going CSM and focus specifically on simplicity at the time. number of events attended, and then number of job applications. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we could also go deeper into these levels, but we decided that we're going to first start out at a higher level, just so that we can get, you know, an understanding of a baseline, and then we'll have lots of questions and different layers to add in from there. But again, just to get started and get this off the ground. I also want to note, we focused data only from fiscal year 15 through fiscal year 17, and that's just data that was in our Simplicity system, so we're not bringing in data from Handshake quite yet. And some examples of how we're looking at these, the engagement score. For example, if a student has no appointments, they get a 0. 1 appointment, they might get a 4. Number of applications they submit, if they submit 2 to 4, they would have a 7. So these are all weights and a score for each category, which our graduate intern looked at to take a big 20,000-foot view of all this information, break it down, and then from there, we're going to start applying a weighting scheme. So that's where we're starting to go towards. So we ended last semester with a discussion on what the best weighting scheme would be, and that's where we're at right now. So lessons and challenges so far at this point in the process. Campus partners are really invaluable. Like I said, the 2 campus partners that I mentioned, they have really great perspective. We've also had some conversations with institutional research and assessment to also just respect their data processes and understand what other information we might be able to bring in. I would say both a lesson and a challenge is access to university data. So while, you know, we idealistically were like, oh, we could learn about this cohort code or race, ethnicity, et cetera, you know, having the conversations with the partners, we realized, you know, it's not as easy as that, but the partners are willing to share that information, or if you know, have a unique ID and you don't apply identifying information to it, they might be able to do some analysis with the information that we have. So those are really valuable lessons that we've learned from the process thus far. And also just having the 20,000-foot view. My colleague Mark and I were discussing that oftentimes we're so locked in on the day-to-day, and it's really just generally nice to look at this information from a 20,000-foot view and look at the bigger picture of our mission and our services and the students that we're serving, and finding that we are meeting a lot of these students already. We just want to understand it on a much more detailed level to help us improve, bridge any gaps, you know, and maybe bring on new resources or new programs. So it's been exciting and refreshing to look at our data in a different way and again, give it some more meaning. So where we're going from here, bringing it all together. Our goal is, again, this semester is to focus in on the weighting scheme and start applying the score. And then take a look at what we learned from that and use that in our strategic planning this summer. And then from there, start looking and reporting and expanding on it. Again, taking a deeper dive on the data. And we completely understand that more questions will definitely be coming up as we go through it, but that's what we're really looking forward to. So it's been really fun, I have to say, and like I said, it's been a refreshing experience, and it's really exciting to start bringing together a lot of the work that we've been focused on for the last couple years into this bigger picture. And before I turn it back over to Hillary, I just want to note these are some of the articles that my colleague Mark he found to help us bring some context and understand what some of the literature is already saying as well, if anyone else is interested in this. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Hillary, I believe, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Great, and can folks hear me now?
Yes.
Fabulous. All right, well, thank you, Shannon. That was great, and it's interesting to see some of the parallels and then, of course, differences between what you're doing at Temple versus what Bryn Mawr has been doing. Of course, one of the first differences being scale. But that said, in some ways, still very similar projects. So I guess I'm going to sort of take some facilitator privilege and ask a couple of questions myself, and then I'm going to open up the floor. And also, I hope you guys will make the PowerPoints available. So particularly that last slide with all those resources, we can make sure that gets emailed out to folks on the call. So I guess and I don't know maybe Temple, it's too premature in your process for where you are in terms of like actually getting data and looking at it and seeing what you're seeing. But one of the things I noticed, Dana, that you said, that's obviously of interest to us, was you said there were no appreciable differences between first-gen students and non-first-gen students in terms of who is availing themselves of your services, which is fantastic. I'm wondering though, like, did you see other subgroups that maybe were less participatory? And without sort of, you don't necessarily need to share all of the, the details. I'm just curious, like, what you found that you weren't suspecting, and what some of your thinking is about how you might then address it. So, like, if there's this other sub, whether it's first-year students or students in certain majors or whatever.
Okay, great. So in my particular working group, once we kind of narrowed down to the one question, we really did just focus on that first gen aspect. But one thing I could share, just to elaborate a little bit, was that the first gen students and their non-first gen counterparts, once they engaged with our services, they engaged in roughly the same number of level 5 programs and the same number of level 2 programs and so on. But what we looked at then was how many total first-gen students are there on campus, and then how many first-gen students participated in something that academic year that we had records for. And then we did the same thing for those not identifying as first-gen. And so there was a higher percentage of all non-first gens that used us versus first gens out of all first gens that used us. So what that suggested to us was that, how do we get the word out in the beginning to bring them in? Because once they come in, then they travel through the same number and depth of programs as their non-first gen counterparts. So some of the things we brainstormed were, maybe trying to do some kind of focus group, getting to know folks. There has been at new student orientation a first goers welcome reception, but then I think that has morphed into another event, and so maybe trying to find who is leading the welcoming of our population there each year when they're brand new to campus, and might there be something we can do to kind of pair up with that. But certainly we wouldn't want to create any new interventions without first asking the folks that identify themselves as first gens and share, hey, we've noticed this, what do you think? Some theories on our end might be, are they needing to work more hours and can't come to our programs as much, or do they just not know about it? Are they not checking the same channels that we're pushing in marketing the events out to? So those are some of the just initial questions that we came up with on that. So hopefully that's helpful. Katie, I think, has another thing to add to it here.
Yeah, I would just add, I think what was interesting with the data, and when we looked across all the different, athlete, financial aid, no financial aid, underrepresented minority, and then the breakdown of those, the percentages were very relatable and comparable to the class population. And I think even the data set that I was working with was the 17-18 class year, and so Dana, when they were doing that project, it was the class year before. And so, like, for example, if I look at the class of 2020, first gens who participated in one or more Lilac programs, we have 55% of the first gens. And then for the total class of 2020, it was 51%. And so, and we sliced and diced that in a number of different ways. The one thing I will say about Bryn Mawr's population that is very important to take note of is that we are small. And so until we have sort of multiple years of data, it is hard to generalize with some of the findings. And so we just have to take that data very carefully.
That's great, thank you. And Shannon, did you want to like chime in on that, or like have you actually started to get this data and take a look at it versus, I mean, your process was quite extensive.
So, one thing that we learned already just from bringing in the information that we were interested in for the engagement score, we did learn some averages and standard deviations as far as like the different levels. So that was really interesting to see. For example, we saw the average number of OWL network logins was 14, where minimum was 1 and then maximum was over 1,400, which probably was a staff member. But it was just interesting to start seeing that. As far as like applying first gen and historically underrepresented groups, we're not there yet. That's where those are the conversations with our campus partners right now to get that information to code them properly.
That's great. And so can you just say a little bit more about who those campus partners are? Certainly here at FEND, because we interact with so many different parts of a campus, you know, we always are sort of struck by how, you know, and this is by no means just at Temple, but, you know, Penn, Bryn Mawr, LaSalle, small schools, big schools, everyone, that, you know, in some ways one office has no idea what the other office is doing. And so I'm just like, I always am, you know, yes, collaborate on campus. And so who are those campus partners? What are the other, you know, departments and offices that you are working with in order to do this project?
So one of the great parts about Temple is there's a lot of committees. So number one, we have our career network. So we're part of the Central Career Center. And then there's different schools and colleges have different size staff that are focused on student professional development. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, great.
So we're part of the undergraduate studies office. So as I had mentioned, within that central office, there's someone who's the assistant director of strategic initiatives. So she works with a lot of data. So she was the key person that we included in this. And then there's also data committees that I've been a part of before. So I've just been tapped into that side. So that's how we knew that Lori Salem, who heads up the Student Success Center, we were aware, and also from our senior director, Rosalie, knowing that all of her work. So we knew that we wanted to tap into her and just understand a little bit more about what she looks at. And then also, because of my work with the First Destination Survey, I'm well connected to institutional research and assessment. So connecting with them, those are the places that we started, just existing knowledge of people who are working with the data on a regular basis. And then also at Temple, we have what's called the Student Collaboration Center. So when we set up our handshake system and also our simplicity system, we worked with them in terms of like pulling in the data. So I know that they're also a resource we can tap.
I think because it's at 3 o'clock and we're, you know, at time, I think I'm going to wrap it up. But I just want to thank Dana and Katie again for presenting, and as well as for Shannon, and really starting us off on a conversation. I think the last thing that I'm going to ask is just, and this would be for everyone on the call, you know, are there topics like this is, you know, for us to sort of come back with, you know, in a few months, we want to have another one of these webinars or even a face-to-face meeting if a local institution wanted to host. You know, if there's other things out there related to this data question of like, what are we knowing about our low-income first-gen students? How are we figuring it out? I'm all ears for sort of future topics for meetings and webinars. So if anyone has suggestions, let me know. Feel free to also email me privately. And I will get the PowerPoints both from Bryn Mawr and Temple and send them out. And I just want to thank everyone again for participating, and to our speakers. All right, so thank you all and have a great rest of the rainy day.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks.